Hi, I'm Bob Crane. Ready to shoot another scene for Hogan's Heroes.
Appointment. He didn't show up. An actress friend came here looking for him. She found his body still in bed.
And he was discovered about 2 o'clock this afternoon from an acquaintance of his.
Police say they have little to go on so far. No weapon, no suspect.
But Crane's real-life luck ran out when he was murdered in his bed, with his killer never brought to justice.
He was the man who made America laugh, the charming Colonel Hogan, who always outsmarted the enemy on primetime television. But behind the quick smile and perfect timing was a life filled with secrets, betrayal, and an obsession that spiraled out of control. And just as he was ready to turn the page, his story ended in a brutal and mysterious death that Hollywood still refuses to talk about. For decades, the truth has remained locked away. The question still haunts everyone who knew him. What really happened to Bob Crane? Before Bob Crane became a household name on television, he was already a rising star on the airwaves. In the 1950s, Los Angeles listeners knew him as the man of 1,000 voices, the witty morning host at KNX Radio who could charm anyone. He was not just reading news or spinning records. He was improvising voices, cracking jokes and interviewing Hollywood's biggest names. Marilyn Monroe, Bob Hope, Charlton Heston, all passed through his studio, and Crane had a knack for making even the most polished celebrities feel like they were caught in a casual, unscripted moment. Walt Disney himself once called him the fastest wit in the West, and the label stuck. By the early 1960s, his confidence and energy had made him more than just another radio personality. He was a name Hollywood insiders recognized. Steady television soon came calling. In 1961, Carl Reiner appeared on Crane's radio program, and the chemistry was instant. Reiner offered him a guest role on The Dick Van Dyke Show, where Crane played a slick, philandering husband. Lightly dramatic, it was only one episode, but audiences noticed him. Sharp, charismatic, effortlessly funny. That performance opened the door to more opportunities. Soon, Crane landed a regular role on The Donna Reed Show as Dr. Lockett. Dave Kelsey, the upbeat dentist next door. Rising energy. He had found his way into millions of living rooms, but his ambitions were bigger. Then came the script that would change everything. In 1965, Crane's agent handed him the pilot for a new show called Hogan's Heroes. At first glance, Crane thought it was a war drama, a strange choice for lighthearted television. But when he read more closely, he realized it was a comedy about Allied prisoners of war outsmarting their bumbling German captors. Measured. The premise was risky, even controversial, but Crane saw potential. He accepted the role of Colonel Robert Hogan, and from the moment the series premiered, audiences were hooked. Hogan's Heroes became an instant success, running for 6 seasons and earning Crane 2 Emmy nominations. His face was everywhere, on billboards, in magazines, even on children's lunchboxes. He had gone from radio voice to television star, the quick-witted colonel who always had a plan. For millions of viewers, Bob Crane was the embodiment of charm and leadership, a man who seemed destined for decades of stardom. But even in those glory years, cracks were forming. Those closest to him noticed changes, restlessness, an appetite for thrills that never seemed satisfied. While the world laughed with Colonel Hogan, the man behind the role was already chasing something else, something far more dangerous. While Bob Crane was cementing his reputation as America's clever colonel, a different side of his life was starting to take shape, one that few outside his inner circle ever saw. His fascination with cameras began innocently enough in the mid-1960s. Like many celebrities of the era, he enjoyed taking photos and experimenting with the new video equipment that was hitting the market. At first, it looked like just another hobby, something harmless that kept him busy between shoots. But the deeper he went, the more consuming it became. The camera stopped being a toy and turned into a central part of his world. The turning point came when fellow Hogan's Heroes actor Richard Dawson introduced him to John Henry Carpenter, a video equipment salesman with connections at Sony. Carpenter was not a celebrity, but he had access to the latest gadgets, and for Crane, that was irresistible. Measured, the two bonded quickly, geeking out over cutting-edge tech that most people had not even seen yet. Carpenter helped Crane set up recording gear in hotels and apartments, making it easier for him to document nearly every part of his life. To outsiders, it seemed like an eccentric friendship built around electronics, but those who looked closer saw something more troubling. The pair soon became inseparable, showing up together at bars and nightclubs. Crane's fame gave him an open door anywhere he went, and Carpenter was often at his side, introduced as his manager. Behind closed doors, they spent hours filming, experimenting, and pushing boundaries. What began as curiosity was sliding into obsession. Colleagues noticed the difference on set. Crane, once laser-focused and sharp, grew distracted. His mind was not always on the script or the performance. It was on what he would be doing after the cameras stopped rolling. The obsession took its toll on his home life. Crane's marriage to Ann Terzian, his high school sweetheart and the mother of his 3 children, had already been strained by his long hours in Hollywood. Now, with his growing preoccupation and constant nights out, it collapsed. After more than 20 years together, the couple divorced. He soon remarried, tying the knot with Patricia Olson, known to Hogan's Heroes fans as actress Sigrid Valdis. But even this new marriage could not escape the same problems. Crane's fixation followed him everywhere, creating cracks that never healed. By the early 1970s, his behavior was no longer a private issue. Executives began noticing. Even during the filming of Disney's family comedy Superdad in 1973, his offset actions raised eyebrows and damaged his professional image. Word began spreading that Bob Crane was not the reliable star he once appeared to be. Instead, whispers of his double life traveled through Hollywood, slowly chipping away at his reputation. To the millions watching Hogan's Heroes reruns, Bob Crane was still the smiling colonel who always had a trick up his sleeve. But behind the curtain, the reality was much darker. His camera was not just a tool, it had become a symbol of the life he could not step away from. And that obsession was pulling him further from the spotlight and closer to a future he never expected. By the mid-1970s, Bob Crane was no longer the golden boy of primetime television. Hogan's Heroes had ended in 1971 after 6 successful seasons, and while reruns kept his face familiar, the momentum of his career slowed sharply. He was still a recognized name, but the offers were not pouring in the way they once had. His growing reputation for strange behavior off-camera did not help. What had started as whispers among colleagues was now seeping into Hollywood's larger conversation. Bob Crane was distracted, unstable, and maybe even too risky to hire. The Disney film Superdad in 1973 was supposed to represent a clean career move, a family-friendly project backed by one of the biggest studios in the world. But reports from the set told a different story. Crane's fixation on his private habits followed him, and executives who had once considered him a safe, likable star now saw red flags. By the time the movie was released, it did little to reignite his career. In fact, for many in the industry, it confirmed what they feared: Crane was no longer bankable. Steady, as television moved into the late 70s, Hollywood was shifting, and Bob Crane struggled to adapt. Instead of major roles, he found himself in guest spots, minor appearances, and eventually touring stage productions. He was still working, still performing, but the spotlight had dimmed considerably. Friends who had known him during the height of Hogan's Heroes could see the difference. On stage, he was still sharp and charismatic, but off-stage, he seemed restless, unsettled, and desperate to hold on to something that was already slipping away. At home, things were not any easier. His marriage to Patricia Olson, once filled with promise, was deteriorating under the same pressures that destroyed his first: arguments, long absences, and his inability to walk away from destructive habits all took their toll. For a man who had once seemed to have everything, fame, family, and financial security, his world was growing smaller. Then came the friendship that had once seemed harmless, but was now turning into something darker: his bond with John Carpenter. The man who had introduced him to new technology was now tied to his worst impulses. Crane confided to friends that he was tired of Carpenter, tired of the lifestyle, and ready to start over. He spoke about leaving the cameras behind, repairing his personal life, and focusing again on his craft. But for all the talk of change, the reality was harder to grasp. Carpenter was still in the picture, and the baggage of their years together was impossible to ignore. By 1978, Crane was clinging to stage work, performing in dinner theaters and regional productions. It was not glamorous, but it kept him busy, and it gave him the chance to keep connecting with audiences. Friends noticed flickers of the old Bob, the wit, the charm, the spark that had once made him unforgettable. He was talking seriously about divorce, about cutting ties with Carpenter, about a real fresh start. To those who knew him best, it sounded like a man trying to pull himself back from the edge. But the momentum of his past was already chasing him. And in June of that year, just as he was preparing to take control of his life again, fate intervened in the most brutal way possible. By the summer of 1978, Bob Crane seemed poised to finally change direction. He had relocated to Scottsdale, Arizona, far from the intensity of Los Angeles, and was performing in a light-hearted stage comedy called Beginner's Luck at the Windmill Dinner Theater. The work was not glamorous, but it was steady, and for Crane, it represented a chance to reset. Friends recalled him speaking about a fresh start, divorcing Patricia Olson, and cutting ties with John Carpenter once and for all. For a man nearing his 50th birthday, it felt like a turning point, but instead of a new chapter, it would become his final act. On the morning of June 29, 1978, Crane failed to show up for a planned lunch with his co-star, Victoria Ann Berry. Concerned, she drove to his apartment at Winfield Place, a modest complex not far from the theater. What she found inside has haunted Hollywood ever since. Crane was discovered lifeless in his bed, the scene both shocking and deeply unsettling. He had suffered severe head injuries, later believed to have been inflicted with a blunt object, possibly a camera tripod. An electrical cord was found near his body, but it was not the cause of death. The apartment showed little sign of struggle. Nothing had been stolen. No forced entry was evident. Whoever was responsible had either been invited in or had entered silently while Crane slept. Almost immediately, suspicion narrowed to John Carpenter. He had flown into Phoenix days earlier to spend time with Crane, and the two had been seen together the night before the murder. Reports suggested they had dinner, then went back to Crane's apartment, where they watched some of their private recordings. Carpenter later claimed he returned to his own motel afterward, but witnesses contradicted parts of his story. The timeline did not add up, and investigators began to focus on him. As word spread, the public was stunned, not just by the crime, but by what police uncovered inside Crane's apartment. Cameras, tripods, and videotapes littered the rooms, many containing recordings that revealed the hidden side of Crane's private life. For years, he had been celebrated as the smiling, quick-witted colonel of primetime comedy. Now, headlines painted a far darker picture. Instead of America's affable sitcom star, he was portrayed as a man consumed by obsession and entangled in a scandalous double life. The revelations devastated his family and friends, many of whom felt his entire career was being erased in favor of sensational details. For investigators, the equipment was both a clue and a complication. It tied Crane directly to Carpenter, who had supplied much of the gear, but it also fed a media circus that quickly overshadowed the search for truth. What was clear from the very beginning was that this was not a random break-in. The killer had to be someone who knew Crane well, and someone Crane trusted enough to let inside. But proving who that was would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. The discovery of Bob Crane's body should have triggered a swift, airtight investigation. But in Scottsdale, Arizona, 1978, the local police department was not equipped for a high-profile homicide involving a national celebrity. They did not have a specialized homicide unit, nor the resources of a major city force, and that lack of preparation showed almost immediately. From the start, critical mistakes were made that would haunt the case for decades. Grave scene was poorly secured. Neighbors, friends, even members of Crane's own family were allowed inside his apartment before evidence was fully collected. They left behind fingerprints, footprints, and hair, creating contamination that investigators would never untangle. Photographs were taken, but not enough. Items were bagged, but not always properly. The cameras, tripods, and videotapes found throughout the apartment were seized, but their handling was inconsistent, and questions about the chain of custody arose almost immediately. What could have been valuable evidence quickly turned into a muddled mess. Still, suspicion naturally focused on John Carpenter. He had been with Crane the night before, and his proximity to both the victim and the equipment found in the apartment made him the obvious suspect. Police searched Carpenter's rental car and discovered small smears of blood on the interior. At the time, DNA testing did not exist. The best investigators could do was blood typing, which revealed the samples were consistent with Crane's blood type. It was not conclusive, but it was damning enough to raise eyebrows. Carpenter insisted he had nothing to do with the murder. He claimed he left Crane's apartment after they finished dinner and watching tapes, and that he returned to his motel alone. But his timeline was shaky, and witnesses reported seeing inconsistencies in his story. Despite this, without a clear weapon, usable fingerprints, or reliable forensic technology, prosecutors hesitated. The Maricopa County District Attorney declined to bring charges, citing insufficient evidence. Carpenter was allowed to return to Los Angeles, though his reputation was forever tainted. For more than a decade after Bob Crane's death, the case sat unresolved. gathering dust in the Scottsdale police files. But by the early 1990s, advances in forensic science gave investigators hope. DNA testing was now becoming a viable tool, and detectives believed it might finally provide the missing link between John Carpenter and the murder scene. Two investigators, Barry Vassell and Jim Raines, decided to reopen the case, determined to find something the original team had missed. Steady while combing through old evidence, they came across photographs of Carpenter's rental car, images showing what appeared to be biological material inside the vehicle. The original samples had long since been lost, a devastating blow for the investigation, but the photographs themselves became critical. In 1992, John Carpenter was arrested in Los Angeles and extradited to Arizona, accused of killing his longtime friend. Dramatic, the trial, which began in 1994, unfolded like a Hollywood drama. On one side, prosecutors argued that Carpenter's motive was personal, anger and jealousy over Crane's attempts to cut him out of his life. They pointed to the blood evidence, the suspicious timeline, and testimony from Crane's son Scotty, who recalled his father saying he wanted Carpenter gone. The state painted Carpenter as a man who had crossed the line from loyal friend to bitter enemy. Measured, but the defense countered with equal force. They reminded the jury of the botched original investigation, the contamination at the crime scene, and the missing biological evidence that might have been crucial. The tripod theory, that Crane had been struck with his own camera equipment, was dismissed as speculation, with no murder weapon ever recovered. The defense also raised the possibility of other suspects, including people who might have held grudges against Crane for personal or professional reasons. Somber, when the jury finally returned its verdict, it was clear they were not convinced. In 1994, John Carpenter was acquitted of all charges. For him, it was vindication. For Crane's family, it was another wound. Carpenter maintained his innocence until his death in 1998, never wavering from his claim that he had nothing to do with the crime. The acquittal of John Carpenter should have been a turning point, but for Bob Crane's family, it only deepened the wound. Instead of closure, the trial had ripped open the most painful parts of their lives and laid them bare for the public to consume. In the courtroom, prosecutors and defense attorneys dissected not just the murder, but Crane's personal world. For his children, it was devastating to see their father's legacy reduced to tabloid fodder. Gentle, his eldest son, Robert Crane, spoke candidly about how painful it was to sit through testimony that focused on his father's private habits rather than his career. The man who had been a pioneer in radio, an Emmy-nominated television star, and a performer who brought joy to millions, was now remembered mostly for scandal and tragedy. Robert admitted that the trial left him with more questions than answers, and the constant media fixation on the darker elements of his father's life only compounded the hurt. Another son, Robert David Crane, voiced even sharper suspicions. He pointed out that Bob's will left his entire estate to his second wife, Patricia Olson, while excluding his children and his first wife, Ann Terzian. For him, that detail was impossible to ignore. He openly suggested that Patricia may have known more than she revealed, though prosecutors never pursued her as a suspect. His comments added another layer of bitterness and speculation to a case already drowning in unanswered questions. Steady, even after John Carpenter's acquittal in 1994, the Scottsdale police and Maricopa County prosecutors never fully closed the book on Bob Crane's case. Technology was advancing quickly, and investigators hoped that modern DNA analysis could succeed where 1970s methods had failed. For years, the possibility of a breakthrough lingered in the background, giving Crane's family a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would come out. In 2016, that hope seemed within reach. Phoenix television reporter John Hook persuaded authorities to allow new testing on the remaining blood samples from Carpenter's rental car. It was the first time Crane's case had been revisited with the most up-to-date forensic tools. Forensic analysts combed through the degraded material, searching for clarity that had eluded investigators for decades. The results were a mix of promise and disappointment. Analysts found traces of two separate male DNA profiles. One belonged to an unidentified man. The other was too degraded to confirm or deny Carpenter's involvement. Worse, the testing consumed the last of the material, leaving nothing behind for future analysis. Grave for Crane's family, it was a gut punch. After nearly 40 years, the case was still unresolved, still locked in limbo. His son Robert, who published Crane's Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder in 2015, admitted that closure would likely never come. Ship described the experience of living with his father's unsolved death as existing in a constant fog, never fully able to move on. No matter how hard the family tried, Hollywood rarely mentioned Bob Crane without attaching his name to scandal. His greatest achievement, Hogan's Heroes, was overshadowed by the circumstances of his death. Articles and documentaries almost always framed him as the sitcom star whose secret life ended in betrayal and mystery. For the public, the smiling colonel was no longer the man they remembered from television. He was a tragic figure, frozen in time by a crime that remains unsolved. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Bob Crane was more than a headline, more than the tapes, more than the trial. He was a man who made millions laugh, who helped shape the golden age of television, and who brought warmth and quick wit to everything he touched. Yet because of one night in Scottsdale, and the secrets that surfaced afterward, his entire legacy was rewritten. Decades later, the case is still open, but the truth may never be known. The evidence is gone, the suspects are gone, and the chance for answers has likely died with them. All that remains is a story of brilliance, betrayal, and an unsolved mystery that continues to cast a shadow over Hollywood. Bob Crane's life ended in tragedy, but his story endures, not just because of the crime that silenced him, but because of the laughter he once gave the world. Laughter that can still be heard every time Colonel Hogan outsmarts the guards on late-night reruns.